Negotiations. Supah, Ritz, Vol.2, Chapter 12. I wish I could say that my conversation with Mike Medavoy over proper compensation for my role at Phoenix Pictures was just the opening salvo in a protracted negotiation where he went to the mat to secure my services for years to come. But that's not what happened. To be honest, I'm not sure there's an amount of money or incentive package he could have offered me that would have made me stay. The exercise of selecting my next 4 movies had demonstrated to me that the job was at best Sisyphean and at worst a kamikaze mission for my career. Too little money would have made me resentful. Too much money would have made my inevitable failure even that much more acute. I wasn't sure which I wanted less. I have found over time that I was pretty good at closing deals for my company, but I had to know the parameters going in. What did we want? What would we settle for? When it came to myself, I never knew the answer. I never knew what I wanted or what I would settle for. So with Mike, there never really was a place to even begin making a deal. A more strategic exec might have taken Mike's vote of confidence and shopped it around town for a competitive offer. But I did not do that either. Instead, I did the thing I've always done, for better or worse, and put my nose to the grindstone and lost myself in the work. It's not that I believed my rededication to the Phoenix slate could sway Mike's opinion of my value. Instead, I believed that work would beget work. Through the business of actively developing and producing my projects, I would meet the right agent or director or producer or star who would recognize my value and help launch me on the next leg of my professional trajectory. I still believe in this strategy, even though it has never once worked. Nonetheless, there is consolation in staying busy. There is excitement in collaboration. There is satisfaction in getting things done. By this point, John Ottman had delivered his director's cut of the Urban Legend sequel, and we had taken it out to Winnetka for a screening. The idea back then was that you could get a less jaded audience if you just drove 15 minutes up the freeway. Hilarious. We were always surprised to find the Valley denizens as knowing and cynical as the people living in Beverly Hills. I always found the testing process terrifying. Sony distribution and creative brass would inevitably attend, and the value of your month's worth of work would be decided by the fickle impulses of some random crowd. While it's true the audience is always the ultimate arbiter of a film's value, I came over time to seriously question the strategy of tailoring the story to give them what they want. They don't know what they want. They may think they want a happy ending, but particularly after I started doing stand-up, I came to believe what the audience really wants, more than anything else, is an authentic experience with the creators, an authentic experience with the medium itself. Still, the fundamental questions the researchers asked during the testing process are always worth bearing in mind during the filmmaking process. The most valuable questions I found were, is there anything you found confusing? And where does the film feel too slow? In the case of Urban Legend's final cut, the audience loved the opening, a movie within a movie, but felt the film lagged before we got to the first murder. It was a fair critique. And in all my experience, I have never met a test audience who felt the first act of a movie moved too fast. They always want it to get going faster. In the first cut of Urban Legends, no one was killed until at least 20 minutes into the film. It was boring. The audience had bought tickets for a horror movie. We had to give them some horror. After a quick brainstorm, the creative team decided that the urban legend we wanted to feature as a new murder set piece in the middle of the first act would be the famous kidney heist. This is the story where an unwitting co-ed gets roofied at a bar, wakes up in a strange hotel in a bathtub full of ice with a missing kidney, and a note telling them to call 911. While there was no narrative imperative to include this scene, and no way to tell it with the characters we already had in the film, we decided to shoehorn it in as a means of introducing the serial killer's storyline, even if it had no impact on the rest of the film. Scott Derrickson and Paul Boardman wrote a quick, effective scene that involved 2 sets, a bar and a gnarly hotel room. We made a budget and found a standing set in Los Angeles that could serve as both locations. Mike gave the reshoot the green light. All we had to do was find a cast. To be candid, the idea of the kidney heist had, from square one, gone hand in hand with the image of a lightsome co-ed passed out naked in a tub of ice. This is Hollywood in the 90s after all, so we naturally sought out a little gratuitous sex with our gratuitous violence. If memory serves, Paquette was pushing for the role to go to Jamie Presley. While she would have been great, the reality of casting a one-off murder victim in a derivative sequel in a Hollywood ecosphere bustling with opportunity was way more challenging than just identifying the hottest name and making them an offer. It would be nearly impossible to get a recognizable actor to do the role, let alone one who would be willing to do some partial nudity, for a film in which they appear in 2 scenes and are quickly killed off. It didn't matter how much money you were willing to offer, no agent would let a viable client do the role. Still, Randy Hiller and our producers went after the town looking for an actress who might help the film and be right for the role. Ultimately, they settled on Jacinda Barrett. Jacinda Barrett was not a name, but everyone in Hollywood knew her from the big splash she made on the MTV series The Real World. As the effective president of production, I gave the go-ahead to offer Jacinda Barrett the role. Then, the shit hit the fan. You knew things were bad at Phoenix when David Thwaites, Mike's primary assistant, skulked into your office for a tete-a-tete. He sat sentry outside Mike's door, so he was privy to every conversation that went down in Mike's office. When he showed up in your office, it meant they were talking about you. Apparently, one of my colleagues had gone into Mike's office and told him I was fucking up the reshoot. I had cast a girl who was quite simply not hot enough. That's ridiculous, I told Thwaites. Jacinda's plenty hot. He just pursed his lips. I'm just telling you, get ready for the coal. Thwaites was a child actor, and his penchant for drama and timing is impeccable. Someone should really cast him again. Indeed, moments later, Mike buzzed me and summoned me to his desk. Who's that girl you've cast for Urban Legends? He wanted to know. I told him who she was. I explained the challenges of casting the role. I told him that Jacinda was a cool choice, a secret fan base that might have fun finding her in the film. Had the internet come into full bloom by this point, we might have talked about Easter eggs and virality, but we were probably still a couple years from that. Finally, I addressed the elephant in the room. She's also plenty hot, I told him, regardless of what's been whispered in your ear. He nodded. He trusted me. He trusted my instincts. I was the de facto president of production. Still, he demanded evidence. Get me a headshot. Right away. It was a fair request. I rushed back to my desk and called Randy Hiller and asked that she messenger me Jacinda Barrett's headshot immediately. That's how long ago this was. You could not just pull her face up on your computer. You needed an actual, in-the-flesh, analog photo to look at someone. And then, I prayed. I prayed because the truth is, I had no idea what Jacinda Barrett looked like. My paranoia then immediately kicked in, and it kicked in hard. I like to catastrophize, and this was a ripe opportunity. What if the casting department had no taste? What if they just wanted to get this over with? What if this was just some weird favor they were doing for Jacinda's agent? I decided if her headshot came in and she looked like some ginormous toad, I would just say that's what I find attractive. There was no way I was ever going to admit to Mike or my colleagues that, as my first decision running a film, I had cast someone with exactly zero idea of what they looked like. I waited for a while for the headshot to arrive and my fate to be sealed, but after an hour or so, I couldn't take it any longer. I wandered down the street to Mrs. Garcia's, the burrito stand I frequented for lunch. I had, to a large degree, ceased the practice of incessant business lunches. Don't get me wrong, I loved meeting people over lunch, but I'd gotten insecure about my own desirability. Who'd want to eat with me? I couldn't stand the possibility of rejection, so I'd largely stopped putting myself out there. And now you were more likely to find me at La Salsa than La Scala. I passed a bus stop on my way and made unintentional and unfortunate eye contact with a skinny blonde kid waiting for the bus. He looked homeless and strung out, but there was a brief shock of recognition on his face. I had a passing thought we might somehow be from the same tribe. I dismissed it quickly, though, and continued on my way. You can't assume that every fair-haired white kid with that 1,000-yard stare somehow also hails from your rarefied world of distorted prep school privilege. Still, it's an assumption I always entertain, imputing meaning on some stranger as though they are a vision of Christmas future or Christmas past, a harbinger of the dark fate that surely awaits me. Of course, the vision is always fleeting and quickly dismissed. But on my way back to the office, my hefty veggie burrito in tow, I was always amazed by both my ability to eat the entire thing as well as my inability to not eat the entire thing. The boy caught my eye again. This time he called out, "Hey, do I know you?" At first I thought he too might be operating under the misassumption that we were members of the same tribe. Then I remembered this is L.A., and people are always mistaking others, and themselves, for celebrities. Still, I stopped. "I don't think so," I said. But he was insistent. "Aren't you friends with my brother?" I seriously doubted so. But then he dropped a name that was indeed a close friend, and suddenly I was able to place this errant teen. He was, indeed, a member of my tribe. "What are you doing here?" I asked. I was talking about Culver City and the bus stop, both places you were unlikely to encounter a member of an esteemed East Coast family like his. "I just got out of Brotman," he said, gesturing to the nearby hospital. "I was on a 72-hour hold, but I'm good now," he started rambling. "I just got out. I was going to hook up with my buddy and go up to Leo's, but he bailed, so I'm going to take the bus up to Leo's instead." There was talk of some party, and he gestured to the bus stop as though the bus might actually take him to Leonardo DiCaprio's house. I was struggling to keep up with the plot. Still, I quickly tracked the route to Leo's from my office. How many buses might that take? The kid was speaking fast, using signifiers that barely had meaning to me. Brotman, 5150, Leo. I also had a lot on my mind. Jacinda Barrett's headshot was about to come in. Still, I could imagine if I had a younger brother, sitting on a city bench, fresh out of the psych ward, rambling about Leo DiCaprio. I'd want my friend to intervene. I'd want my friend to help. "Hey," I said, "do your parents know where you are?" He flinched, and I changed tack. Why don't you come to my office? You can use the phone, get a drink, and we can figure out a ride for you, okay? Maybe I can drive you myself, or I can call your brother and he can come pick you up. I thought I'd get some resistance, but speaking from experience, we are all just dying to be saved. He leapt up from the bench and followed me like a puppy, yapping on about Leo and Toby and the big party up in the hills. Once we were up in my office, I called his brother, filled him in on what was going on, and handed the phone off to my charge. I stepped in the hall to give him some privacy, and moments later, a messenger materialized with Jacinda's headshot. I quickly tore open the envelope, and, spoiler alert, immediately saw that Jacinda was just as adorable an actress as anyone could ever want. I let loose a sigh of massive relief. You can fault me for the impulsiveness of my decision-making, but I don't think I did it that wrong. Gina Matthews wanted her, and Randy Hiller wanted her. These were the people I trusted. I hadn't thought twice about supporting their choice. That's ideally the way it should work. I poked my head into the assistant's bay and let them know that I had a mixed-up kid sitting in my office and asked them if they wouldn't mind keeping tabs on him. They were all younger than me and seemed sympathetic to my plight. As I marched back toward Mike's office, I could hear the kid, sitting on my couch, yapping away proudly that he was in some fancy Hollywood studio and there were celebrities everywhere. I admit it, the delusion briefly fed my own. Poor kid, I thought. I hope he sorts it out. I then proudly marched Jacinda's headshot into Mike's office. Mike was not alone. He was sitting there with the exec who had started this madness to begin with. Mike studied the headshot and nodded his approval. Very good, he said, and handed the headshot to my colleague as if Mike was as eager as me to put this conversation behind us. Yeah, the other exec offered back. But will she take her top off? I started to laugh. This, in my mind, had never been a prerequisite for casting the role. Sure, we had talked about the scene being sexy. I know we're talking about a girl whose kidney has been removed, but the whole thing does have a sort of comic book aesthetic. But there had never been nudity to date in any Phoenix picture. Guys, I said, this was never going to be a topless role. Never. There were some groans. I felt like a killjoy, a schoolmarm, like the whole episode was an indictment of my manhood. But I was also right, and everyone knew it. Still, Mike justifiably demanded I set the parameters with Jacinda's agent for what we could and could not show on screen. We were, after all, planning on shooting her in a white tank top in an icy tub of water. There was a good likelihood everyone might balk. Jeez, I thought, maybe I am in over my head. The good news is I couldn't worry about it too much because I still had a strung-out teen hanging out in my office whose crisis was more acute than any nudity clause. My friend called and told me the kids' parents were on their way. I don't know what they were doing in Los Angeles, though they'd probably been notified their son was in lockup, flown out here to help him out. I waited. I didn't tell the kid his parents were coming. I was worried he'd tried to escape, and I was terrified there'd be some scene. Somehow it all felt like my fault, and I worried Medavoy would see it that way too. Guilt by association. My own madness was some kind of homing beacon inviting the lunatics to Phoenix to roost. But the kid greeted his parents with civility, maybe even a sense of relief. It was hard to tell. But the sense of self-worth and value I got from stepping away from my own narcissism and angst to help another soul left me ready to contend with Jacinda's agent. It put my own crisis in perspective. I wish I could remember who Jacinda's agent was at the time. Holler if it's you. But I settled on my couch. Somehow this always made me feel more comfortable, more in charge, and dialed her up. I wasn't exactly coming to this conversation from a position of strength. Jacinda had already made it clear she would only do the role for a flat, generous fee, I believe it was $10,000 for the day, and a guarantee the role would go uncredited, on screen, and in paid ads. Not exactly a ringing endorsement. I got right to the point. Some people find this rude, I think, but when I start a conversation where I have a clear agenda, I generally like to let people know, right from the top, what this is all about. In this case, the purpose of the call was Jacinda's wardrobe, and I made it clear we intended to put her in a white tank top and a tub full of icy water, aka a wet tank top. The agent, clever, said that was fine. As long as Jacinda was wearing a bra. I was like, no, we do not imagine her in a bra. At this point, the agent dispensed with the niceties. There's no way my client is doing this role in a wet, see-through white tank top with no bra, period. Oh, God. I wanted to die. I wish I could say I was embarrassed to even be in this position, having to negotiate how much flesh we could exploit in our film, but the truth is, I was just mortified I was going to fail at this first negotiation and come back to Mike empty-handed. Or worse, I was going to be forced to present something decidedly not sexy to my boss. Jacinda will only do the role in a wetsuit. I think Randy Hiller must have been on the call because someone, and I just don't believe it was me, suggested maybe Jacinda could wear a dark tank top instead. Wow, a middle ground. I always forget this exists, that things rarely end in ice or fire. There's almost always a middle ground. Okay, the agent said, that could work. She can wear a dark tank top, but you cannot show her nipples. This, for me, was a red line. And while I mentioned up top that the key to negotiating is knowing what you want, I have also found that to win almost any negotiation, it's helpful to have on your team at least one crass pig. I have often found myself taking on this role. We're gonna need to see her nipples, I said. Really, I should be ashamed, but this is the kind of minutia creative conversations in Hollywood sometimes come down to. The agent wasn't having it. I already told you my client is not showing her nipples. It was a standoff. While the crass pig is great for setting terms, it actually requires something more supple to close. In this case, I turned to the filmmaker's prerogative and their sacred obligation to verisimilitude. Look, I said, she's going to be in a tank top in a tub full of ice. The tank top is going to get wet. It's going to cling to her body. There's no way her nipples won't be indicated. There was a long pause. Indicated, the agent repeated, chewing over the implications. Fine, she said. You can have that. Nipple indication. My client will wear a dark tank top and you can film her in a way that allows for nipple indication. Nipple indication, I declared with delight. It's a deal. And we both burst out laughing. I don't know if the words nipple indication actually made it into the final draft of Jacinda Barrett's deal memo. And to be honest, I'm not even sure nipples were indicated. If memory serves, they were not. Sometimes that's how it goes. You negotiate to protect yourself in failure. You negotiate to reward yourself in success. You try to set parameters you can live with for the rest. But a negotiation is an abstraction, and real life, in the end, inevitably intervenes, altering conditions on the ground that redefine everyone's terms. Reality often dictates a new set of acceptable parameters, and that's probably what happened with Jacinda and Ottman when they got to the set. And it's ultimately what happened with me. While I couldn't kickstart negotiations with Mike on my own, reality did eventually intervene, and I found myself with a new baseline for what I could live with moving forward, and a way to start negotiations anew.